Shabbat shalom. Why did our ancestors wander 40 years in the desert? After all, it's no more than an 11 or 12-day walk from Egypt to the Promised Land. So how could it possibly have taken 40 years? So the really bad one-liner that you've probably heard is that Moses, like all Jewish men, refused to ask directions. Some of you hadn't actually heard that one, and it was generous. That was very generous, the laughter that you shared. So that can't possibly be the answer. In fact, our tradition gives us an answer in this week's Torah portion as to why it is that our ancestors wandered for those 40 years. This parasha is the first portion in the fifth and final book of the Torah. So here's the context. Moses is talking to the children of the slaves. Only a few are left from that generation who will actually go into the Promised Land, Joshua and Caleb. Everyone else has been born in the wilderness, and they've been raised in this journey of wandering. And Moses is explaining to the Israelites why it is that they had to wander for 40 years. And he tells them that the original plan, immediately upon receiving the Torah at Sinai, was to get up and go to the Promised Land and to take possession of it, to conquer it. But he says, instead of jumping up and starting on the journey as our ancestors were supposed to, what happened? Our ancestors said, wait a second, we want to send scouts out. We want to find out what this land is all about. We want to see what it's like. And so they sent out the spies, and the spies come back and they share their report, and they say, in fact, the land is flowing with milk and honey, but there's a problem. There are other people who are already there possessing the land. And they have fortified cities. They're very strong. And in fact, some of them are anakim. Some of them are giants. And the people fall apart. They weep. They rend their clothes. They don't know what to do. And according to our tradition, this unwillingness among our ancestors to up and go, and instead the desire to send out the spies, and then upon hearing the report of the spies falling apart and feeling as if it was a mistake to have left Egypt in the first place, that this is the sin that results in this terrible punishment of 40 years of wandering. God had told the people repeatedly that the land they were going to was a good land. And God had told the people that God would go with us, that God would guide us. And the people had witnessed the miracles, the parting of the Red Sea, the 10 plagues. They had tasted the manna day by day. They saw God's presence, and yet they lacked faith in God. And if for a moment you think, well, maybe it's not really about faith, that can't possibly be the entire reason for the punishment, the parasha goes a little bit farther and actually makes it explicit. It's absolutely clear. Because when Moses says to the people, don't be afraid, God is with you, God will fight for you, just as God fought for you in Egypt. This is all in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy. And Moses said, and God carried you like a father carries his son, like a parent carries a child. That's how God cared for you. After all that you witnessed, then Moses says these words to the Israelites. He says, Einchem ma'aminim ba'adonai. After all that, all those things, you still have no faith. You don't have emunah. Einchem ma'aminim ba'adonai. And so our ancestors wander for 40 years as punishment so that a new generation can arise, a generation that can believe. And the truth is, I'm not sure if that generation ever came. And perhaps God ultimately gave up and came to accept the fact that despite the many blessings, the many gifts, the bounty of our lives, we lack faith in God's goodness. We lack faith in God's presence. We lacked faith in the inevitability of redemption, the triumph of good over evil. Much of the faithlessness that we experience is about what we see in our lives, or perhaps if we were to be a little more honest with ourselves, it's about what we choose to see in our lives. It was a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey, but the spies saw the fortified cities and the Canaanite warriors, And they forgot their own strength. They forgot about their leadership. And of course, they forgot about God, who had promised to journey with them in a cloud of glory during the day and in a pillar of fire at night. So too with us. So too we often fail to see God's goodness all around us. We fail to appreciate the gifts that God gives us, and this leads to faithlessness. We are, despite the challenges we face and the very real fears that are out there in the world, we really are surrounded by blessings. Just this week, you probably heard that astronomers have identified a planet. I think they said was it 15 million light years away? 14 million light years away? Very long ways away. There seems to be a planet that is approximately the same size as planet Earth and approximately the same distance from a sun that's about our size. So it's an extraordinary finding, but it's a rare finding. So the fact that life can exist on this planet at all, this pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan, Alav HaShalom, used to describe it, that's the miracle of miracles, and we experience it every single day. What more evidence of God's goodness and God's bounty could we possibly want? Now, there is darkness in our world, to be sure. Indeed, tonight, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the 9th of Av, this day that we commemorate the destruction of the first temple and of the second temple, and a myriad of other tragedies that befell our people over the centuries. Tomorrow night, because it's Shabbat, the observance is pushed until tomorrow night. Tomorrow night we'll gather again at 7:30 p.m. at Zweiback Temple for a community-sponsored commemoration of Tisha B'Av. Dean Josh Hollow, who's a wonderful, wonderful scholar, and the Dean of the Hebrew Union College, will be teaching, and I'll be participating along with Rabbi Stern and other members of the clergy of the Los Angeles community. So there's darkness in our world, and we know about that darkness. And there is anxiety, and there are things to be afraid of. We worry, especially now, about nuclear proliferation, about extremism and terror, and we wonder how it can possibly be contained. We wonder if our allies, if our friends in the world will truly be there for us. We, a minority people, relatively powerless when we think about the vast sea of humanity out there. We wonder if our friends will be there for us here in this country and among the nations of the world, and for our brothers and sisters in Israel, thousands of miles away. And we are, understandably, at times afraid. We know the harsh things that the world has done to us. But here's the thing, and this is really important. Our tradition seeks to contain the fear, to limit it. And know this too, our tradition is ultimately a tradition of hope. It's not a tradition of fear. We limit the fear. So think about Tisha B'Av. It's one day of mourning in the Jewish year. And yes, I know there are other days of mourning, but if you look at the year as a whole, there are far more days of celebration, far more days of joy, far more days of gladness than there are dark days. And we consolidate on Tisha B'Av the memories of our suffering into this single moment in the Jewish year. We contain it and we limit it. So when Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbat, Shabbat trumps Tisha B'Av. So not only do we consolidate the pain into one day, we also tell ourselves, but the Sabbath, the joy of the Sabbath, which is a regular joy, we experience it every week, that joy is so great that it trumps the sadness of Tisha B'Av. We are not meant to be ruled by fear. And our tradition is a tradition of hope. Not, to be sure, the Pollyannish type, refusing to see the real danger or the real darkness that's part of our world. We have our eyes wide open to the darkness that's in the world, but we believe. And this is perhaps what faith is, ultimately. We believe that better days are in fact ahead of us. We believe that redemption is not just possible, but that it will be realized. Someday, we might not live to see it, but it will come, and we believe that the work of our hands and the work of our hearts and the simple acts of kindness and love that we act out in the world will bring us just a little bit closer to redemption. That is a deep, deep Jewish belief, and it is itself an act of faith. It is the essence of Hatikvah. It's our refusal to accept injustice and hatred as inevitable or just the way things are. It's Adon Olam. It's at the heart of that prayer, a prayer of extraordinary faith, a 1,000-year-old poem of emunah. The last words of Adon Olam, Biyado afkid ruchi, be'et ishan va'ayira, v'im ruchi gaviyati, Adonai li velo ira. I place my soul in God's hand. When I'm asleep and when I'm awake, there it is. As my spirit is in my body, God is with me. Velo ira. I will not be ruled by fear. Look, faith is hard. We know this. Our ancestors knew it. According to our tradition, they experienced the power of God's redemption firsthand. They saw the miracles in Egypt. They walked through the Red Sea that had been torn asunder by God's power. They ate the manna daily. They tasted it with their own mouths. And yet, we learn in this week's parashah, Enchem ma'aminim ba'Adonai. They who saw all of these things were unable to maintain their faith. How much harder it must be for us. We didn't see those miracles. We didn't see the water part. We can only visualize it. And we haven't tasted the manna. So it's hard. And the noise of our world makes it harder still. There are real problems, and there are real dangers, and there is what to fear. And if you make the mistake of listening to the evening news, all you see are the dangers and the fears. And it feels like it's suffocating. But fear is to be contained, and hope is to be magnified. And our tradition is actually designed to help us to do this. When we gather together in moments like this, when we offer blessings of thanksgiving, when we come closer to one another, we experience that faith, that hope, that belief that redemption is possible, and that we have a role to play in bringing that redemption about. When we hold one another, when we are held by one another, we're stronger in our faith in a world of goodness and a world of love. When we recall God's love for our people and for all humanity, our faith is strengthened. And when we say those words of Adon Olam, we tell ourselves and one another, as we live and breathe, God is with us. Velo ira. We will not be ruled by fear. We have wandered long enough. It's time for redemption.